The topic of today's presentation is software and cybersecurity for medical devices and the product liability implications. Medmarc's webinars are for educational purposes only and are not intended as legal advice. I'm Courtney Stevens, an attorney at Medmarc's Loss Control Department. On behalf of Medmarc and today's presenters, Daniel Wittenberg and James Melendrez, thank you for joining us. Daniel Wittenberg is a partner in the Denver office of Snell & Wilmer. His practice is concentrated on representing manufacturers and distributors of products across a vast array of industry sectors, including life sciences, medical technologies, consumer products, appliances, food and healthcare products, oral and personal care products, power generation, and timber. He regularly defends these companies in product liability litigation, as well as counsels these businesses on agreements, risk avoidance and management strategies, labeling and marketing materials, instructions for use, as well as recalls and regulatory matters, including those involving the FDA and CPSC. Dan has served as national counsel for major medical device manufacturing concerns and regional as well as local counsel in mass tort cases. He has attained certification as a global regulatory affairs compliance professional. He also works with entities in the technology transfer and intellectual property matters, including university technology commercialization, litigation, licensing, and agreement negotiations. He also represents individuals and companies in commercial litigation. Representative clients also include renewable and clean energy companies, such as the leading manufacturer of solar cells, panels, inverters, and imaging detectors, as well as one of North America's largest wind energy companies. He is co-chair of the firm's Pharmaceuticals and Medical Devices Industry Group. He is listed in the Best Lawyers in America Product Liability Litigation Defendant and named by L&G as a Life Sciences Star. He is peer review rated AV preeminent in Martindale-Hubbell and currently assists clients throughout the western United States, including Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, and Utah. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Dan, who will begin today's presentation.
Thank you very much, Courtney. I really appreciate that. And let me just say a couple things before we begin. First, Snell & Wilmer is a full-service law firm with over 400 attorneys throughout the offices that Courtney mentioned. And we have the pleasure of working with industry sector clients throughout their life cycle. Second, I've had the distinct pleasure of representing and defending Medmarc's insureds for over 20 years, so I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in today's webinar. I'm particularly pleased to be able to introduce to everyone today one of my new partners, James Melendrez, who's going to be speaking quite a bit on the topic that we're participating in the webinar on today. James focuses his practice on cybersecurity, incident preparation, and emergency response, related regulatory compliance and civil litigation, as well as white-collar, criminal defense, and government investigations. Drawing on his extensive experience as a former federal prosecutor, James focuses his practice on representing companies in high-stakes litigation and advising clients on crisis and risk management. Prior to joining our firm, James served in the leadership offices at the Department of Justice as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General, where he oversaw legal and policy issues regarding sensitive cyber matters. And he also led some of the Justice Department's most high-profile and complex matters, including the prosecution of former CIA Director David Petraeus for mishandling classified information and making false statements to the FBI. And with that introduction, James, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. And it's a pleasure to be joining everyone today. And as Dan mentioned, we're excited about the opportunity to present this webinar with Medmarc. The title of the presentation is FDA's Guidance on Software Security for Medical Devices and the Related Products Liability Implications. To give you an overview, it is really becoming the accepted wisdom, and this is reflected in the FDA's recent guidance that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, that the question of cybersecurity risks, attacks, breaches is really a question not of if, but when. And no matter what security precautions are implemented, no matter how high network defenses are built or how prolific detection software or other technical defenses are deployed, inevitably there will be an incident or a breach to be dealt with. And so, preparation is key. And the overview of our presentation today really has three different phases. The first is I'm going to provide an overview of the current cyber threat landscape. Dan and I are then going to review the most recent FDA guidance regarding cybersecurity and medical devices. And lastly, we will talk about more broadly the implications that these cybersecurity risks have for products liability in this space. Now, regarding cyber threats generally, I wanted to start with a fairly broad perspective. Both the current FBI Director, James Comey, as well as the previous FBI Director, Robert Mueller, have made the point that there are really two types of companies, those that have been hacked and those that don't know they've been hacked. And so this is a growing threat. The Director of the Office of National Intelligence has made similar broadly sweeping statements. As you'll see here, James Clapper, as recently as February of this year, made the point that the current cyber threat environment facing companies and facing the country generally is, in his words, daunting. Now, when I was at the Department of Justice, where I worked, as Dan mentioned, both as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General on cyber matters, and also where I served as the department's representative to the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, we at the department and at the FBI took the position that and advocated for a new paradigm in confronting this type of risk, which is to promote a public-private partnership. The public, in terms of the FBI, the Department of Justice, DHS, in this instance, the FDA, really needs to have the cooperation and buy-in of the private sector to help confront these threats. And that was largely the point that Director Comey made at this speech that he offered in April of this past year. Now, at that speech, Director Comey identified, in general, 5 different categories of cyber threat actors. And I think that this is a good way to think about the cyber threat generally. So cyber actors that face the most, or that cause the most serious and persistent and sophisticated threats are those that are nation-state sponsored or directed. The primary nation-states that are involved in these types of attacks are China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And to be clear, the cyber threats that are facing companies, not just in the life sciences sector, but across all sectors and all industries in the United States, are being directed by nation states. They're well-funded, they're well-resourced, they are sustained campaigns. There are also multinational cyber syndicates. When you think about this threat, this is, to put it bluntly, Eastern European organized crime. These individuals are primarily focused in theft for cyber theft for profit. Purveyors of ransomware, this is a new and growing threat that is particularly problematic for healthcare, for hospital systems. Ransomware, as we'll talk about in just a few minutes, is a strand of malware that encrypts standalone machines or entire networks, and more recent strands are encrypting both networks and backups. And so it can be extraordinarily debilitating to, for example, a hospital or a hospital system. Hacktivists, these are individuals who use cyber-enabled means to make political or social points. So when we talk about this group of threat actors, we're talking about website defacements, attacks of that variety. And then lastly, there are terrorist organizations, including ISIL and ISIS, which are using the internet, using social media to advance their aims. And so these five actors, or these five actor sets, exist distinctly, but it's also the case that there are not clean lines. And so this is all an interrelated web of very serious, sophisticated actors that we and you need to be concerned about preparing to defend against. In addition to outside actors, another threat that should always be present when you're thinking about how to defend your networks is an insider threat. These insiders, whether they are have some evil motivation or are suffering through personal or financial distress, pose significant dangers to companies because they have access to networks, sensitive information, may have administrative rights, and so maintaining vigilance in terms of defending against insider threats is also an important part of cybersecurity. Now that we've talked about the threat actors generally, what are the primary categories of actual damage that can occur or injury that may affect companies in the life sciences sector and more broadly? And the first is the theft of confidential business information and proprietary technology. It is the case that day in and day out, companies within the United States and without are having their intellectual property stolen through cyber-enabled means and exfiltrated offshore, such that nation states and their proxies can leapfrog years of research and development, simply by deploying malware that allows them access to a company's crown jewels and allows them to exfiltrate that data outside of the United States. A very, very potent threat is that of destruction of information and systems. Here, think about the attack on Sony Pictures. DDoS attacks. These are attacks whereby thousands of compromised computers, known as botnets, are directed to contact a single website at one time, thereby overwhelming the website and preventing it from providing outward-facing services to its consumers. We talked about a couple of these next points before: website defacements, malicious activity by activists, and then finally, there is also the threat of financial crimes or other frauds committed through cyber-enabled means. One growing threat in this area is business email compromise, where scammers, socially engineer emails to employees within a company who have the ability to wire money to offshore accounts, and that threat is growing serious and has resulted in well over $750 million in losses in the last couple of years. Now, in general, speaking to life sciences, speaking to healthcare, and speaking more broadly, there are a few particular legal challenges that are overlaid against this complicated threat environment. And I thought I'd just try and frame the rest of our discussion with these regulatory and litigation challenges. The first is cyber preparedness and regulatory compliance. This is legal steps that need to be taken in advance of any type of cyber incident. Then when there is an incident, this is point number two, conducting rapid cybersecurity response and managing the crisis. And then third, following, whether it's a cyber attack or a breach or some other type of cyber incident, including, for example, the malfunction of a medical device due to a cyber issue, there will inevitably be litigation that ensues. And so these three different phases are a helpful frame for the remainder of our discussion. So moving now more narrowly to cybersecurity and medical devices, the need for effective cybersecurity is important in order to assure medical device functionality, which has become increasingly important with the growing number of medical devices that are designed to be networked to facilitate patient care. There's obviously a need to balance the desire for interoperable devices with increased cybersecurity. And the fact of the matter is that sharing information across platforms presents additional risks. Here, the takeaway is that medical devices can be hacked, which increases their vulnerability to other connected devices or networks. And the reverse is also true. Networks and other devices can be hacked, which increases the vulnerability of medical devices. And these risks pose a danger to the safety and effectiveness of medical devices. The FDA, a few years ago now, in its June 2013 safety memorandum, summarized these risks. And they identified the following as particular problems. A device that's infected or disabled by malware, hospital computers infected with malware that might be targeting devices, password-related issues, failure to timely update software. It is true that the vast majority of network intrusions result due to unpatched vulnerabilities. And so some basic cyber hygiene can go a long way to preventing serious network compromises. And then finally, the FDA identified the manipulation, loss, or unauthorized disclosure of patient data as another significant risk. Now, this is something I mentioned previously. Ransomware is another significant and growing cyber threat in the life science space, in the healthcare space. This is a problem for hospitals, hospital systems that are increasingly connecting their network to medical devices. And just, for sort of definitional clarity, I'll go through a couple of these points. Ransomware is a form of malware that targets both human and technical weaknesses in organizations and individual networks to deny access to critical data and systems. This ransomware is frequently delivered through spear phishing emails, and it has the result of encrypting the victim machine, victim network's data, and denies further access. When the victim organization finds out that it's locked out of its data, the bad actor then demands the payment of ransom. Typically, they demand that ransom in the form of bitcoins, which is a variety of cryptocurrency. It is, popularly believed to be untraceable. It's actually not, but it is very difficult to trace. And the rise of cryptocurrency has triggered the rise of ransomware because it is profitable given the difficulty in tracing who the payments are being made to. In exchange for the ransom, the bad guys promise to provide the victim with the means to regain access to their data. That means is the encryption key. And recently, and I alluded to this previously, as the ransomware has evolved and developed in terms of its sophistication, it is now targeting enterprises, and it is encrypting not just entire networks, but also the backups of a particular network's data. This is an example of one of the most popular forms of ransomware known as CryptoLocker, and this is the type of screen that an infected user would see after a successful deployment of ransomware. You'll see the demand for the Bitcoin. You'll see, a particular due by date and a promise to deliver the keys in exchange for the ransom. Now, as I mentioned, this threat is growing. On this slide, I use the word skyrocketing, which I think is a good way to describe it. You'll see that whereas in 2014 and 2015, the total amount of reported payments related to ransomware was, north of $24 million each year. This year, through the first quarter, that is nearly grown by 10x to $209 million paid. The FBI, well, before I get to that, this is just an example of some of the most recent hospital attacks. Hospitals in California, in Henderson, Kentucky, MedStar in Washington, D.C. and Maryland, Kansas Heart Hospital in Kansas, have all publicly been reported to have suffered ransomware attacks. Hospitals are particularly susceptible to ransomware attacks, for the same reasons that cybersecurity is such a problem for medical devices, and that is that, hospitals are in the business of providing patient care, and the data that they possess in large part relates to patients, and lack of access to that data, destruction of that data, just like in the life sciences and medical devices sectors, can have extraordinarily devastating consequences. And we're talking about people's lives, and so when hospitals are confronted with a ransomware demand, they can't afford to be without access to their systems. Much like the threat to medical devices, is always going to be an imminent one. The same is true with respect to these ransomware attacks on hospitals. Now, the FBI recently, issued guidance on ransomware payments, and their guidance was basically, and this is a publicly available document, you can look for it on the internet and find it very quickly. Their guidance is that they do not support the payment of ransom, but they do recognize that companies, corporations, executives have complicated calculations to make, and in some instances, may choose to make ransom payments. I would note that, before doing that, there are legal considerations, that should be thought through pretty carefully. By nature, the perpetrators of these type of attacks are criminals, and they often are not standalone criminals, but may be affiliated with organized criminal groups, terrorist organizations, et cetera, who have secondary purposes for the information that they have encrypted or, more broadly, in some instances, stolen from companies. In addition to the ransomware threat, still talking about threats that affect companies in this space. The FDA last year in 2015 released 2 safety communications regarding Hospira products, in connection with cybersecurity risks. So in May 2015, there was a safety communication about PCA3 and PCA5 infusion pumps. It was determined that the computerized infusion pumps featured a vulnerability that, if exploited, could allow an unauthorized user to modify dosage, causing over or under infusion. Just a couple months after that, so just about a year ago, last July, there was a safety communication issued regarding the Symbik infusion system. And here, as mentioned on the slide, it was discovered that this computerized pump which is designed to deliver infusion therapy, could be accessed remotely by an unauthorized user through the hospital's network. This harkens back to one of the points I made at the outset, which is the interconnectivity of networks and medical devices increases the attack area, and that vulnerability led to the product's discontinuation and the FDA's recommendation that users switch to an alternative as soon as possible. So that is an overview broadly of the cyber threat landscape, of cyber threats affecting life sciences, healthcare sector, as well as particular safety communications that the FDA released as to medical devices. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague Dan Wittenberg to provide an overview of the guidance issued by the FDA over the last several years.
Thanks, James. In response to the concerns and risks that James has been talking about, the FDA began focusing its attention on medical device software in the early 2000s and began issuing guidelines containing cybersecurity recommendations. The FDA outlined general principles of cybersecurity issues in network medical devices in January of 2005 by issuing the Cybersecurity for Network Medical Devices containing off-the-shelf software. It then made recommendations to device manufacturers and healthcare facilities for ensuring that appropriate safeguards are in place to protect medical devices and hospital networks by issuing the June 2013 Cybersecurity for Medical Devices and Hospital Networks FDA Safety Communication. And this communication was released in conjunction with the FDA's 2013 Premarket draft guidance, and many of those recommendations are reiterated again in the FDA's 2014 Premarket guidance. In October 2014, the FDA released guidance pertaining to managing the cybersecurity of medical devices during the development and pre-market stages. In October of 2014, on October 2nd, the guidance was issued entitled Content for Pre-Market Submissions for Management of Cybersecurity and Medical Device Guidance. And then most recently, the FDA released a draft guidance addressing the management of cybersecurity issues after medical devices have been released with the January 22nd, 2016 document entitled Postmarket Management of Cybersecurity in Medical Devices draft guidance. Next slide, please, James. The increased focus on cybersecurity is consistent with recommendations from other government actors. For instance, the Presidential Policy Directive 21, Critical Infrastructure, Security and Resilience, which was issued February 12, 2013. This tasks the federal government to strengthen cybersecurity and to reduce vulnerabilities and minimize and disrupt threats. It encourages all public and private stakeholders to share responsibility in achieving these desired outcomes. Executive Order 13636, Improving Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity, was issued a week after the Policy Directive 21, recognizing that cyber threats to national security are among the most serious, and stakeholders must enhance cybersecurity. And then also the Department of Health and Human Services Office of the Inspector General, the OIG, issued a 2016 work plan which discusses their intention to scrutinize the monitoring of network medical devices. And in it, the OIG said it will examine whether the FDA's oversight of hospital network medical devices is sufficient to effectively protect associated electronic protected health information and ensure beneficiary safety. And this work plan has been closely followed by the most recent draft guidances. Next slide, please, James. Now, this is really just a reminder for everyone that FDA guidance and position statements really is more a reflection of the FDA's current thinking on a topic, and it's not binding. It does not create or confer rights, and it's non-binding on the public and the FDA, but as perhaps we'll talk about a little bit later when we get into the discussion around, potential product liability exposure issues, it can be persuasive. All of these items can be persuasive, and so it's important that we have these discussions and pay attention to them, and device manufacturers heed these and contemplate them as they move forward with respect to their product development. Next slide, please. So, as James mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit about the 2013 Safety Communications, Cybersecurity for Medical Devices and Hospital Networks. Generally, as you can see, this item was released in 2013 in conjunction with the Premarket draft guidance. The communication addressed not only medical device manufacturers, but also hospitals, medical device user facilities, healthcare IT staff, and biomedical engineers. The purpose, of course, being to recommend steps to ensure appropriate safeguards are in place to reduce the risk of failure due to cyber attacks. The communication emphasizes that manufacturers are responsible for remaining vigilant, identifying risks, mitigating risks and hazards, and also reviewing cybersecurity policies to ensure appropriate safeguards are in place. The extent to which security controls are necessary on a device depends on the type of device, its environment of use, the type and probability of risk to which it is exposed, and the probable risk to patients from a security breach. Next slide, please, James. Thank you. It puts forth both recommendations, as I mentioned, to manufacturers and healthcare facilities. And with respect to manufacturers, it proffers the following. It talks about limiting access to trusted users, and of special importance are life-sustaining devices and devices connected to hospital networks, which James mentioned earlier, that there be security controls for limiting access, which should include user authentication and strengthening password protection, also something James mentioned earlier, to protect individual components from exploitation, to use designs that maintain the device's critical functionality even when security has been compromised, and these are known as fail-safe modes, and provide methods for retention and recovery of information after an incident occurs. With respect to healthcare facilities, it repeats some of these same themes, but all of which are very important, and that is to restrict unauthorized access, monitor the network for unauthorized use, develop and evaluate strategies to maintain critical functionality under adverse conditions, and to be able to contact, and importantly, to contact the device manufacturer in the event of a cybersecurity problem. Next, back to you, James.
Great. Thanks, Dan. Now, moving from the 2013 guidance to the 2014 final guidance issued by the FDA, this was entitled and concerned the content for pre-market submissions for the management of cybersecurity in medical devices. The scope of the 2014 guidance, which was issued, as Dan mentioned earlier, on October 2nd of 2014, includes medical devices that contain software, medical devices that contain programmable logic, and software that is itself a medical device. The 2014 final guidance included some general pre-market principles that framed the overall document. Those principles were that addressing cybersecurity during the design and development of the medical device can result in more robust and more efficient mitigation of patient risks, and that manufacturers should establish a cybersecurity vulnerability and management approach as part of the software validation and risk analysis that is already required by the quality system regulation. So the point here is that the FDA's guidance stresses the need for manufacturers to have, front and center from the inception of their design process, cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities. In terms of this vulnerability and management approach, there are 5 different items that should be addressed. First of all, the identification of assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. Second, after those identifications are made, an assessment of the impact of threats and vulnerabilities on the device functionality and the end users, meaning patients in many cases. There should also be included an assessment of the likelihood of a threat and of a vulnerability being exploited. A determination, this is the 4th factor, a determination of risk levels and suitable mitigation strategies. And finally, an assessment of residual risk and risk acceptance criteria. And on this final point, an assessment of residual risk and risk acceptance, this harkens back to one of the very first points I made, which is regardless of the precautionary steps that are taken, there will likely always be a risk. And the FDA's guidance recognizes that, but it is unfortunately a part of the current cyber threat landscape. Now, the 2014 final guidance also discusses cybersecurity functions and suggested controls for devices and for device manufacturers. These are based on the National Institute of Standards and Technology framework. It's often called the NIST framework, and the framework basically includes 5 features: identification, protection, detection, response, and recovery. With respect to identification and protection, the FDA's guidance made the following points: that medical devices capable of connecting are more vulnerable than devices that are not connected, an obvious but important point. And then it listed, in terms of protections, 2 examples of security functions that should be considered. The first is limiting access to trusted users only. And in that regard, there are a few particular action items that the FDA mentioned, including utilizing 2-factor authentication, obviously user IDs and passwords, smart cards, potentially biometric identification. They also identified, taking steps to ensure that content is entrusted, and with particular action items to include verifying sender and verifying that messages are contained in code that's not been changed. Another possible method of ensuring that the content is entrusted is through signature verification. So broadly, those are identification and protection steps that can be taken by device manufacturers to confront cybersecurity risks. In terms of the other NIST points, detection, response, and recovery, the FDA made these recommendations. The device manufacturers should implement features that are functional during normal use, that allow for security compromises to be detected, recognized, logged, timed, and acted upon. The manufacturers should develop and provide information to end users regarding appropriate actions to be taken upon the detection of a cybersecurity event. That manufacturers should implement device features that protect critical functionality even when the device's cybersecurity has been compromised. And finally, that device manufacturers should provide methods for retention and recovery of the device's configuration by an authorized user. The 2014 guidance also set forth cybersecurity documentation that should be included in pre-market submissions. That includes hazard analysis, mitigations, and design considerations related to intentional and unintentional risks, a traceability matrix that links actual cybersecurity controls to the cybersecurity risks considered, a summary of the plan to provide valid updates and patches as needed throughout the life cycle of the device to ensure safety and effectiveness. This is related to, broadly the threat that unpatched vulnerabilities pose, that lack of software updates present, in a variety of contexts, including, desktop machines, networks, and obviously also to medical devices running on software. The last two types of documentation to be included in pre-market submissions, a summary of the controls in place to assure the medical device will remain free of malware from the point of origin to the point when the device leaves the manufacturer's control, and device instructions for use and product specifications related to recommended cybersecurity controls appropriate for the intended environment of use. Now, whereas the 2014 guidance concerned pre-market submissions, the 2016 draft guidance, which is not yet final, it is draft guidance, which was issued on January 22nd of this year. This concerns post-market management of cybersecurity in medical devices. Broadly speaking, the purpose of this most recent FDA guidance is to provide recommendations to manufacturers for post-market management of cybersecurity in medical devices. And the context for this is that it was issued after the presidential policy directive and executive orders that Dan mentioned earlier, which call for an increase in cybersecurity across the federal government. It was also issued after the OIG's work plan discussing scrutinizing the sufficiency of the FDA's monitoring of medical devices. So this all fits into the broader context of heightened scrutiny of cybersecurity, heightened awareness by the White House and throughout the federal government. This most recent post-market guidance applies to medical devices containing software, medical devices containing programmable logic, software that is a medical device, so effectively the same scope as the pre-market guidance. It does not apply to experimental medical devices or investigational medical devices. The 2016 draft guidance includes a variety of new definitions for controlled risk, for compensating controls, for cybersecurity routine updates and patches, cybersecurity signals, essential clinical performance, remediation. I'm not going to walk through each and every one of those new definitions, but I would recommend spending a little time looking at this guidance and reviewing those definitions. One in particular to focus on, in my view, is the definition of controlled risk. Again, this relates to this accepted wisdom that inevitably there will be vulnerabilities either that are not conceived of at the time a device is manufactured, or that simply cannot be completely eliminated. Controlled risk has been defined as that risk that is sufficiently low that the device's essential clinical performance will not be compromised by a cybersecurity vulnerability. And that's compared to uncontrolled risk, which is unacceptable residual risk. The other concept that is an important feature of the 2016 draft guidance is that related to information sharing. It is a critical component of the post-market draft guidance, and it discusses ISAOs, which are a very prominent feature that are developing and evolving across different sectors and industries. This is the formal term is information sharing analysis organizations. They promote information sharing and collaboration. They gather and analyze information with the purpose of better understanding cybersecurity problems and communicating and disclosing critical information. And they do that with sector-specific focus. So the FDA has entered into a memorandum of understanding with one of these organizations, which is the National Health Information Sharing and Analysis Center, or the NHISAC. You will hear this term ISAC pretty frequently in discussions about cybersecurity and what industry is doing. There's an auto ISAC, there's a financial services ISAC, FS ISAC. Virtually every sector has an ISAC, and this National Health ISAC is the ISAO for life sciences, healthcare, etc. Now, the other point that is made broadly in this draft guidance issued in 2016 is that cybersecurity risks are continuously evolving, so it is not possible to mitigate risks through pre-market controls alone. And it then identifies proactive post-market management techniques, and these include information sharing, for example, through the NHISAC, promoting good cyber hygiene through routine maintenance, in addition to routine maintenance, routine patches and updates, assessing post-market information that affects the cybersecurity of medical devices, employing a risk-based approach to characterizing vulnerabilities, and then making the timely implementation of necessary actions to address any post-market cybersecurity vulnerability. A few more points about these post-market cybersecurity management programs. The FDA's guidance makes clear that this is an essential piece that must be implemented as part of the quality system regulation, that it should emphasize addressing vulnerabilities that may impact patient safety, and it identifies a few, including unauthorized access, modification, misuse or denial of use. And as we discussed earlier, this post-market cybersecurity management program should be based on the NIST, sorry for the typo, framework, identification, protection, detection, response, and recovery. Again, repeating a theme that is central to our presentation because it's central to the threat confronting device manufacturers, life science companies, and companies throughout other industries. The point here is, as set forth in the 2016 draft guidance, medical devices and their surrounding networks cannot be completely secured. The presence of a vulnerability does not necessarily trigger a safety concern. It's the impact of the vulnerability on essential clinical performance which may trigger safety concerns. The guidance goes on to suggest that manufacturers really think about the life cycle when they are contemplating post-market management of cybersecurity. And in particular, they identify the following 5 features of a life cycle program: identifying hazards, estimating and evaluating risks, controlling risks, and monitoring the effectiveness of controls that are designed to mitigate the risks that have been identified, evaluated, and controlled. More on risk management. Manufacturers should have a defined process to systematically conduct risk evaluation, determine whether a vulnerability presents controlled or uncontrolled risk. This links back to the updated definition that I reviewed with you previously. And then there are three parts to a recommended risk management approach: assessing exploitability of the cybersecurity vulnerability, assessing the severity of that vulnerability in terms of impacts on patient health, and then evaluation of the risks in terms of the essential clinical performance of the device itself. The draft guidance also includes recommendations about what to do to remediate and report cybersecurity vulnerabilities when they are detected. This includes proactively practicing good cyber hygiene and reducing cybersecurity risks even when there is some degree of residual risk that is acceptable. Remediating cybersecurity vulnerabilities to reduce the risk of compromise, again, to the essential clinical performance to an acceptable level. And finally, conducting appropriate software validation under quality system regulations to assure implemented remediation mitigates the vulnerability without creating exposures to other risks. In terms of remediation, they also offer recommendations about properly documenting the methods and controls used in the design, used in the manufacturing, packaging, labeling, storage, and servicing of the medical device, as well as identifying and implementing compensating controls to adequately mitigate the risk. And then finally, and importantly, providing users with relevant information on recommended workarounds, temporary fixes, and residual cybersecurity risks so that they can, these are end users, patients, doctors, et cetera, so they can make informed decisions regarding the device use and take appropriate steps to mitigate. And this, this term, informed decisions, certainly, is something that is a concept related to products liability. 2016 draft guidance has been, as I mentioned, not yet finalized. It's in draft form. Comments that have been received were generally very positive. The overarching theme of the comments was agreement with the FDA that cybersecurity in medical devices is an increasingly important issue. And there was, pretty widespread praise for the FDA's efforts to promote cybersecurity, and also feedback that the recommendations that had been provided were a step in the right direction. One of the most discussed features of the guidance was information sharing. And in general, stakeholders agreed that information sharing was important to increasing cybersecurity in the medical device community, whether it was through the NHISAC or otherwise. But there were concerns raised, and these concerns, while on some level particular to life sciences and medical devices manufacturers, are also echoed in concerns expressed in other sectors regarding sharing information through other sector-specific ISACs. These concerns, are summarized here. What type of interaction will the NHISAC have with the FDA? What is, the scope of the NHISAC? Should there be particular ISACs for medical device manufacturers and a separate one for hospitals? There are questions about, the scope of the information that might be shared with the FDA, concern that sharing information with the FDA could result in investigations that would not have otherwise occurred. Questions about, in the first instance, will information provided to the ISAC be shared with the FDA? So there is significant concern throughout the industry about the type of ramifications that sharing information about vulnerabilities might have on device manufacturers. Taking a step back and thinking about general principles that apply to both pre-market and post-market guidance that's been issued by the FDA, there are a few takeaways that we hope you all leave this presentation with. One is medical device cybersecurity is a shared responsibility between healthcare facilities, providers, device manufacturers. The fact of the matter is that we are going to only become more interconnected, and the interconnectedness of these devices is going to require collaboration and cooperation going forward to ensure that cybersecurity risks are confronted as robustly as possible. Additionally, in terms of an effective cyber risk management program, it should incorporate both pre-market and post-market life cycle phases. And another takeaway is the NIST framework. This is a helpful way to frame thinking about what steps need to be taken, during the design of medical devices, as well as once they have been released to the market, what needs to be done to maintain their cyber integrity, identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover from cyber vulnerabilities and cyber attacks. Implications for products liability. It's clear that the FDA has adopted a view that cybersecurity risks are as serious as defective product risks. That is clear from the type of communication they issued after the Symbiote infusion system and the results of that communication. Dan alluded to this also during his presentation. The FDA's current focus on the cybersecurity of medical devices signals that the requirements will likely be provided in the future. And so while it is guidance at this point, to Dan's point, it is persuasive now and may very well become required in the future. And to prepare for that, device manufacturers should take a proactive approach in our view. Companies should identify cost-effective ways to address cybersecurity issues as soon as possible. And instituting the FDA's recommendations and their draft guidance, or at least instituting large portions of that guidance, will put companies in a better position when, not if, but really when requirements are published. And so with that, on the dot at 12 p.m., we would love to take any questions that you might have.
Can I offer one additional comment in our remaining maybe 60 seconds, James?
Please.
And that is, in the product liability context, because this is such a new and evolving area, there really is a dearth of precedent, so to speak, as to what might constitute liability in connection with product liability and cybersecurity breaches. But to the point that James just made, and focusing on a couple of things very quickly, the traditional pillars of products liability are whether there is a defect in design, manufacture, and/or warning, and this whole area falls within the design concept. And to a point that James also made is that the FDA highlights that the risk mitigation responsibilities don't fall on device manufacturers alone. It's really a shared responsibility. And what that potentially might mean is that there's a creation of some kind of snake pit when it comes time to when potentially claims or lawsuits start to evolve, in which healthcare facilities, patients, providers, and device manufacturers are all put into a position of needing to assess the other's liabilities. And that's potentially a growing concern in the liability arena for us. You can already start to see that's what's been offered in the comment period with respect to some of these guidances. I think a year or so ago was, the Hospital Association, in offering one of its comments, was starting to lay groundwork and foundation of its position as it relates to accountability towards device manufacturers. And so just to reinforce a couple things that James mentioned, is that as we move forward, we can only encourage emphatically that device manufacturers consider the guidance as potential roadmaps for consideration in the conduct of our clients and device manufacturers out there with respect to their conduct in the arena, incorporating these types of suggestions and guidances into their devices at the development stage as soon as possible. And then also think about offering implementation guidelines to integrators, operators, and maintainers of their devices to address issues that may arise after the product is deployed so that there can be issues on risk mitigation in that front.
Okay, thank you. Looks like we've got just a minute or two for questions. If you have a question, please feel free to submit it using the Q&A panel located at the bottom right of your screen. After typing your questions in the space at the bottom, hit the send button. Please be sure to direct your questions to all panelists in the Ask menu. Your questions will not be seen by other members of the audience. So we did get a couple in here. Somebody asked, and kind of with respect to what you were just talking about, Dan, can we look to the FDA for cues as to how this cybersecurity issues will be dealt with product liability? Is the FDA dealing with cybersecurity as a product issue?
Well, I think the way to answer that is a couple-fold. One of which is I don't know that the FDA will ever go so far as deem or make pronouncements as to what constitutes a defect with respect to its guidance. As we talked about, these are representations of the FDA's current thinking, but we know from experience that the guidance will certainly be considered as a factor in assessing any particular company's or business's conduct.
Okay, great. Another one, probably for James. Are there any specific threats right now keeping you up at night?
Yeah, there are any number of threats that keep me up at night. I was, as I mentioned, at the department for nearly a decade, most recently working intensively on cyber matters. And, this very threat, as the Internet of Things expands and evolves and becomes more sophisticated and medical devices are increasingly connected and networked, the potential for really life-threatening consequences is going to grow. And so, I think that, product liability litigation is going to proliferate. And, what keeps me up at night is, in particular in this space, is, vulnerabilities that, may have consequences for, patient health or patient life. As I mentioned earlier, there are sophisticated, well-funded, well-resourced state actors, proxies of nation states that are interested and dedicated in, stealing information, in conducting destructive attacks like we saw at Sony, and, the risks posed by those actors to this space are scary. And so, this is a topic that, Dan and I are passionate about and are, really interested in working with companies to address to try and stem those issues.